Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now in our study to a poem called the Old Feuillage. Now, this French word simply will mean a collection or a bunch of, usually it's going to be flowers, as in bouquet. It will become a powerful symbol. We will watch here. It's so sad. We will watch Walt Whitman go from hope to despair as he genuinely believes that a poem can save the Union, can save the nation. And of course, tragically, and as we hit later in our study of Leaves of Grass, when we hit drum taps and memories of Lincoln, we'll say this again, that it's such a tragedy that things did not end up for Whitman the way that he had hoped. He genuinely hoped that somehow a poem or a group of poems could keep America from heading into the abyss. And of course, the abyss is where it went. Now, the assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net. Down the left-hand side, Talks with Walt is our playlist, and that you've been with us from the very beginning with what I hope is your own annotated copy of Leaves of Grass, from the inscriptions all the way up to and including the previous set of lines that we just finished with as we were turning our attention now to Old Feuillage. Now, the title of that is one thing that we've got to talk about here, but now let's turn as well to, as we always like to do, our Nortons, to talk about this one. We just did Song of the Answer, and now we turn to Old Feuillage, and this is what Norton's has to say. French for foliage, here used symbolically as a universal particular, like leaves of grass. Whitman himself interpreted this poem in the first paragraph of a letter that he wrote, offering it to Harper's Magazine, January the 7th, 1860. Think about your dates, given, of course, the Civil War is 1861 to 65, right? Quote, this is now Whitman. The theory of a chant of national feuillage is to bring in, devoting a line or two or three lines to each, a comprehensive collection of touches, locales, incidences, idiomatic scenes from every section, south, west, north, east, Canada, by the way, spelled with a K. We'll see this in this poem. Texas, Maine, Virginia, the Mississippi Valley, etc., etc., etc. All intensely fused to the urgency of compact America. America always, all in a vein of graphic, short, clear, hastening along, as having a huge bouquet to collect and quickly taking and binding in every characteristic subject that offers itself, making a compact, the whole surrounding national poem, after its sort, after my own style, end quote. The poem was rejected, as many of Whitman's poems were. The poem was rejected, although it appeared in the 1860 edition as Chants Democratic No. 4. The Barrett manuscript shows that it was composed, at least in part, as early as 1856. The poem has undergone little change, and in 1867 it was titled American Feuillage, and it first took its present title in 1881. Now we're going to hear about this 83rd year, and the original manuscript actually read 80th year, indicating that the poem was worked upon as early as 1856. So we can kind of think about right away some of the challenges that will be resurrected in a study of a poem like this. Now, really, this is one of those long catalog poems, so put that in your notes right away. We've seen this already a number of times in our study of Leaves of Grass, just like in Salut Amant, as well as in Passage to India, where we're celebrating the world. Now we're going to be celebrating the U.S. He's going to call it the American soul. He's going to talk about one identity, ever united lands. This is again a poem where, sadly, Whitman is genuinely hoping that America is not going to do the very thing that he probably knew was coming. Now, there is a reading game that many readers of this poem will play, where they will read the poem and they will add up all the different kinds of references to states and the like as we go. Let's turn to the poem now, and as I like to do, read the poem in advance. I'm not going to do that just because of the length of the poem, so we're going to jump right into it with the title and the opening lines. 13 times the word always is in this anaphora as we've seen it in Leaves of Grass is going to start to happen. Always, 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 you will see it. Always, our old feuillage. Now, this feuillage or feuillage term is, again, a symbol of we're collecting something. So think of it that way. By the way, the word hour, think about unity. Old is interesting because America, as he'll say, is 83 years old. It will, of course, be on the 19th of November in 1863 that Lincoln will say it there at the fields of Gettysburg 77 years ago, right? That is to say 87 years old. And it is a fair question to ask. Can you really qualify a nation of 87, in this case 83 years old? Can you call it old? Is it actually old? And it's a fair question. Always Florida's Green Peninsula. Notice the use of the dash, by the way, in this poem. Always the priceless delta of Louisiana. Of course, that word priceless has all kinds of interesting connotations given, right? The idea of manifest destiny and the Louisiana Purchase and all of that. Always the cotton fields of Alabama and Texas. Always California's golden hills and hollows and the silver mountains. Pay attention to the adjective, adverbs, and verbs in this poem. It's quite remarkable. Mountains of New Mexico. Always soft-breathed Cuba. It's interesting that Cuba will be included as part of America in Whitman's view. Always the vast slope drained by the Southern Sea. Inseparable, back to Union, with the slopes drained by the Eastern and Western seas. The area, the 83rd year of these states, again, think of it as 1776 to 1860. And as we've said, you can play the game of different dates depending on when you mark this thing. Of these states, and 3.5 million of square miles, so we're going to start talking about, obviously, the majestic size of America. The 18,000 miles of seacoast and bay coast on the Main, the 30,000 miles of river navigation. We're going to get to rivers here in a bit. The 7 millions of distinct families. We're a very small nation still, aren't we, right, in 1860. Distinct families, and the same number of dwellings, always these and more, branching forth into numberless branches. Notice how the word branches will get used in Leaves of Grass, and obviously here, physical branches, branches of trees and the like, and obviously that notion of the verb of branches, out, reaching out. Always the free range and diversity, always the continent of democracy. And I just want to point out, do you remember back to starting from Pomenog, passage number 10, he said it this way, "My comrade, for you to share with me two greatnesses and a thing, one rising, inclusive, and one and more resplendent. The greatness of love, democracy, and the greatness of religion." Whitman said in 1860, he said that these three things summarize the essential themes of Leaves of Grass. Again, it is love, democracy, and religion. And here we are back. Notice always the free range and diversity, always the continent of democracy, capitalized. Always the prairies. Now we're going to get 7. Prairies, pastures, forests, vast cities. We commented on the fact that Whitman's always talking about the differences between the urbane and the country, right? Travelers, Canada spelled with his K as he's wont to do in Leaves of Grass. The snows, always these compact lands. He liked this word compact as in unified. Tied at the hips, with the belt stringing the huge oval lakes. It's an interesting word picture, given, of course, the Missouri and the Mississippi and the way that you have these rivers, and then, of course, you have the large lakes up to the north. Always the west, and then later it's going to be the south, north, and east. Always the west, with strong native persons, the increasing density there, the inhabitants, friendly, threatening, ironical, scorning invaders. Again, notice how he always likes to put together these things that don't often go together. So, for example, you can be friendly, but you can also be scorning invaders, right? All sites, we're going to get a number of sites in this poem, right? All sites, south, north, east, all deeds, promiscuously done at all times. Now, the word promiscuous is a loaded word here, but it just simply means, by the way, it's the only use in all of Leaves of Grass, believe it or not. It's the only time promiscuously gets used. But what it really means is just over-related to freedom, right? In other words, do what you want. All characters, movements, growths, a few noticed, myriads unnoticed. Think about how Walt Whitman is constantly trying to notice the unnoticed in Leaves of Grass. Through Manhattan streets, he uses the old language. Manhattan streets, I walking. Again, we're back to Song of the Open Road. These things gathering. and it will be a gathering. It will be a feuillage. It will be a bringing together. On interior rivers by night in the glare of pine knots, steamboats, we think about Twain, right? Wooding up, sunlight by day on the valley of the Susquehanna and on the valleys of the Potomac and the Rappahannock and the valleys of the Roanoke and the Delaware, in their northerly wilds, beasts of prey haunting the Adirondacks, the hills are lapping the Saginaw, waters to drink. Notice we're talking now about nature and the beauty of America in terms of its nature. In a lonesome inlet, we'll again study his adjectives and his adverbs and his verbs. Here, the adjective, right? In a lonesome inlet, a sheldrake lost from the flock. We're going to think about his whole dance with birds. Norton's actually will provide us with a really remarkable insight in regards to the whole thing of birds. The lines referencing birds here, all the way through Leaves of Grass, but we're saving it just for this. Norton's points out, these lines on the behavior of birds testifies to Walt Whitman's close observation. In a letter of August 24, 1879, John Burroughs, who had been composing an article on nature in the Poets, confessed, "I cannot catch you in any mistake, as I wish I could, for that is my game." Whitman loves nature, and he especially loves his birds. So we're going to meet the first of our the sheldrake duck, right? Sitting on the water, rocking silently. Pay attention to his eye. Whitman has such an amazing poetic eye now. In farmers' barns, oxen in the stable, their harvest labor done. They rest standing. They're too tired afar on Arctic ice. The she-walrus lying drowsily while her cubs play around. Again, the adverbs, pay attention to them. The hawk, we immediately think, of course, of the barbaric yawp of the hawk of the end of Song of Myself 52. Sailing where men have not sailed, the farthest polar sea, ripply crystalline open beyond the floes, white drift spooning ahead where the ship in the tempest rages. On solid land, what he's done in cities is the bells strike midnight together. In primitive woods, again, notice we move from the city to the woods. In primitive woods, the sounds there also sounding the howl of the wolf. We've paid attention to this word howl already in our study, and obviously makes us think about Ginsberg's classic famous poem. The scream of the panther and the hoarse bellow of the elk. We're going to come back to this notion of the scream of the hawk later, and we'll immediately think of the yawp. And notice how these lines will remind us a lot of Thoreau's Walden. We've given full lectures on all of those sections of Walden. In winter, beneath the hard blue ice of Moosehead Lake, in summer visible through the clear waters, the great trout swimming. In lower latitudes, in warmer air, in the Carolinas, the large black buzzard floating slowly high beyond the treetops. Below, the red cedars festoon with Tyrannia, the Spanish moss, the pines and cypress growing out of the white sand that spreads far and flat, rude boats descending the big PD, the Yudkin, after it enters the southern South Carolina area, climbing plants, parasites with colored flowers and berries enveloping huge trees, the waving drapery on the live oak. Obviously, we have a famous poem in Leaves of Grass about the live oak, trailing long and low, noiselessly waved by the wind. So, notice if you're working in your actual text, you can draw a line. Notice up to this point, it's just been about the amazing majesty of America's nature. Then we'll start talking about all the people. The camp of Georgia wagoneers just after dark, supper fires, and the cooking and eating by whites and Negroes. We're going to get this word several times in Leaves of Grass. As we pointed out, Whitman's racism, we don't run from it. We just simply point out it is going to be a view that will be accepted in Whitman's own time. And so we tolerate it by virtue of our study of history. 30 or 40 great wagons, the mules, cattle, horses feeding from troughs, the shadows, gleams, up under the leaves of the old sycamore trees, obviously Leaves of Grass, the flames with the black smoke from the pinch pine curling and rising, southern fishermen fishing, the sounds and inlets of North Carolina's coast, the shade fishery and the herring fishery, the large sweep sades, the windlass on shore worked by horses, the clearing, queuing, and packing houses. We immediately obviously think of Sandburg's famous Chicago poem. Deep in the forest, in piney woods, turpentine dropping from the incisions in the trees, there are the turpentine works. There are the Negroes at work. We commented on it a few seconds ago. At work in good health. And obviously, it's always going to be a debate when Whitman uses language like this. The ground in all directions is covered with pine straw in Tennessee and Kentucky. Slaves busy in the coalings at the forge by the furnace blast or at the corn shucking. We've commented in other places already about Whitman's relationship to the abolitionist movement and to slavery. And here, notice, he'll just simply talk about how slaves are busy doing their work. In Virginia, and then we've got this very amazing eye. In Virginia, the planter's son, returning after a long absence. We think, of course, of Telemachus, don't we? Joyfully welcomed and kissed by the aged mulatto nurse. And again, this use of the word mulatto is for us going to represent some of the racism of Whitman's own day. On rivers, boatmen safely moored at nightfall in their boats under shelter of high banks. Some of the younger men danced to the sound of the banjo or fiddle. You'll remember the banjo gets mentioned in Song of Myself, passage 47. Fiddle gets mentioned in Proud Music Storm, passage number 3. Others sit on the gunwale, smoking and talking. Late in the afternoon, the mockingbird, the American mimic, singing in the great dismal swamp. By the way, this is marshy region north of the Albemarle Sound of North Carolina. Of course, the mockingbird is an important bird for Leaves of Grass, 7 times mentioned in Leaves of Grass, and obviously we think of Harper's Leaves to Kill a Mockingbird. There are the greenish waters, the resinous odor, the plenteous moss. Notice he's going to solicit all of the senses. As we commented on Wordsworth's Tintern Abbey, similar, those opening lines. The cypress tree, the juniper tree, northward, young men of Mannahatta, the target company from an excursion, returning home at evening, the musket muzzles, all bear bunches of flowers, think of feuillage, right? Presented by women, children at play, or on his father's lap. Notice it's not the mother's lap. On his father's lap, a young boy fallen asleep, how his lips move, how he sleeps, how he smiles in his sleep. I just want to pause and point out, we say about great writers that they show, they don't tell. And here notice that there's such power in a little image. Like, have you ever watched a child sleep and they're, and they're smiling and their lips are moving? It's a compelling image. The scout riding on horseback over the plains west of the Mississippi. He ascends a knoll. Of course, we think of that knoll of Song of Myself 46, right? And sweeps his eyes around. California life. So notice how we're just jumping all over America. The miner, bearded, dressed in his rude here meaning simple, costume. We think of costumes at the beginning of Brooklyn Ferry. The staunch California friendship, the sweet air, the graves, one in passing meets, solitary, just beside the horse path. The West, of course, because, such rough country out here, so many people died. Oftentimes these people were just buried in kind of rough graves. Down in Texas, cotton fields, we'll come back to the slaves again now. Down in Texas, the cotton field, the Negro cabins, drivers driving mules or auction before rude carts, cotton bales piled on banks and wharves. Encircling all, vast, darting up and wide, the American soul. Notice capital A, capital S. The American soul, by the way, it's the only use in all of Leaves of Grass, is right here. With equal hemispheres. One love, one dilation or pride. Notice love, dilation, and pride, all capitalized. Of course, this idea of equality. In arrière, French word for the past. The peace talk with the Iroquois, the Aborigines. Now, we've commented on this once before, because Whitman was confused and conflated about his views regarding Native Americans. In, however, an American Bureau reminiscence, Whitman said it this way: there were moments as I looked at them, talking about Native peoples, or studied them, when our own exemplification of personality, dignity, heroic presentation anyhow, as in the conventions of society, or even the accepted poems and plays, seemed sickly, puny, inferior. That is to say, Whitman at times was always wanting to celebrate Native peoples. Obviously, we've already commented from earlier lectures about his bias and prejudice against Native peoples. But here you've got this very interesting set of lines that are going to play around with some of those stereotypes that will be a part of views of the Native populations and Native Americans. The Iroquois, the Aborigines, the Calmont, maybe Canadian, the pipe of goodwill, arbitration and endorsement, the Shigam, a northeastern American tribe, blowing the smoke first toward the sun and then toward the earth. The drama of the scalp dance enacted with painted faces and guttural exclamations. The setting out of the war party, the long and stealthy march, the single file, the swinging hatchets, the surprise and slaughter of enemies. By the way, he uses this word slaughter only a few times in Leaves of Grass. Go to the Sleepers, passage 5, to see how he does it there. All the acts, scenes, ways, persons, attitudes of these states, reminiscences, institutions, all these states compact. He keeps coming back to this word, huh? Every square mile of these states without accepting a particle. Everything for him about democracy is inclusivist here, right? Me, and now you can draw a line if you're working in your own copy, because now notice what we've done. We've gone from nature, we've gone to just people. Now we're going to begin to get more personal for Whitman himself. Me, pleased, rambling. It's the only use. Isn't that interesting? The only time in all Leaves of Grass that the word rambling gets used. A lover of walking, and this is the only time he uses it. Rambling in lanes and country fields, Pominox fields, observing the spiral flight of two little yellow butterflies, shuffling between each other, ascending high in the air. You'll want to look for the famous photograph that was a front of the Specimen Days image where Whitman sat and posed. It wasn't a live butterfly, but it certainly looks that way in the photograph, but he's holding this butterfly, and it makes us think about this. The only other time butterflies get mentioned in all the Leaves of Grass is warble for lilac time, and that's it, right? And again, this word shuffling is a fun word for butterflies. The darting swallow, we commented already about birds. The destroyer of insects, the fall traveler, southward but returning northward early in the spring. Again, notice the idea of circles of nature. The country boy, we're going to meet the poem, A Child Went Forth. The country boy at the close of the day, driving the herd of cows and shouting to them as they loiter to browse by the roadside. It's an amazing eye, right? The city wharf. Now we move, again, notice how he